right, I don't know where this thing just left off. So this is the Curiosity rover, as I mentioned before, and you know, it's a pretty impressive piece of equipment. It's about the size of a large SUV, and again, it's still working. Again, I already mentioned this. The Viking landers in the 1970s looked for life. The results were not good. Here's something interesting. So occasionally, you know, well, not occasionally, you know, the planets are bombarded by usually just micrometeorites, but sometimes they get hit by rather large objects, you know, larger than a little micrometeorite. And especially if it's something that is, you know, made of metal, because it can survive the atmosphere. Anyhow, there have been little pieces of Mars over the billions of years in the, you know, the history of the solar system that have been hit, you know, that have actually due to a collision with you know, something hitting Mars and basically throwing up rock that has actually, you know, reached escape velocity and has found its way to Earth. There's actually a couple of meteors meteorites that have landed. One in the Antarctic that was discovered in the 1980s and then was really analyzed in the 90s, made a lot of news. It was all sorts of headlines. And if you look at this picture on the right here, it kind of looks like fossilized microbial life. And you know, at first, you know, people thought that that's what it was, and then some other people came up with other explanations. Right now, it's that idea that is actual fossilized microbes is not as popular as it was certainly in the 1990s. All right. So anyhow, that was. All right, so let's talk about the Martian atmosphere. Again, it's very thin, in that the density, like if you think about the density as one atmosphere on the surface of the Earth. Remember, Venus is much closer to 100 atmospheres. Mars is about 1/100th the density of the Earth. Of the Earth's atmosphere, and so it's made. The atmosphere is made mostly of carbon dioxide, but there is a lot of dust that gets thrown up because of the high wind. All right, and we can actually see fog occurring. Of course, it's carbon dioxide fog, not water vapor fog. There's a nice picture showing some of the fog. So remember this whole idea of the greenhouse effect, right? The greenhouse effect is that the carbon dioxide will trap the heat, and we think that Mars is kind of the opposite of what happened on Venus, right? That runaway greenhouse effect. So basically, the problem with Mars in retaining its heat is the atmosphere of Mars being so thin. You know, the heat is really easily escaping out into space. And of course, the reason the atmosphere is so thin is because it has there's no protective magnetic field around Mars the way there is around the Earth. The Earth has a relatively strong magnetic field, whereas Mars does not. And there's little pockets of magnetism, but there's no overall magnetic field on the surface of Mars. So most of the atmosphere has gone into space, and you know, the Martian atmosphere is getting thinner and thinner and thinner as time goes on. Certainly, we think in the billions of years ago, Mars had actually liquid water. I mean, there's lots of evidence. I mean, you saw some of the evidence as well, that in the northern hemisphere it might have had oceans and lakes. But because the fact that the solar wind is constantly hitting the planets, and stripping away the atmosphere, if there's no protective magnetic field, the atmosphere of Mars has gotten thinner and thinner and thinner as time goes on. Those seismic studies have been done. Oh, actually, that's not true anymore. There's actually a spacecraft that just landed on Mars. It was a couple of months ago, I think, and that's actually doing some seismic studies. But we don't expect there to be any seismic activities. But then again, that's why we do the studies, is to find out. You can't just go with your preconceived notions. You have to actually perform experiments. That's why it's science. All right, so there's the thing about the magnetic field. The last little thing about this, the crust of Mars, we think is extremely thick, and so again, we don't expect there to be seismic activity, but again, you never know. Here's the Phobos and Deimos. They're Phobos on the left and Deimos on the right. That's kind of the surface of it. So again, they're not like so Deimos, they're not perfectly spherical. So Deimos, as it says here, is probably the captured asteroid. Phobos probably formed later. They're really, really tiny compared to the size of Mars. I mean, they're tens of kilometers, as it shows here, and so they're rather tiny. All right. So again, lots of things to say about Mars. It's really cold there. That's the other thing. I guess I didn't mention too much. It is extremely cold. Any future astronauts that end up going to Mars will have to have some kind of protection. First of all, because of the magnetic field, the fact that there is no strong magnetic field. So any astronauts on the surface of Mars will be bombarded by solar wind, that's radiation, and so that's not good for life. Actually, they found some evidence for caverns near the volcanoes on Mars in the northern hemisphere, and that might be a possibility of humans landing there and then finding refuge in the volcano tubes. Anyhow, that's for some future astronaut. Actually, they say, and I don't know how true this is, but they say that perhaps the first person to walk on Mars has already been born. So maybe, I don't know. I hope to live long enough to see humans go and explore Mars. It's quite a trip. I mean, it would take about less than a year to get there. And then the problem is, Mars will have moved in its orbit, and then you'd have to wait like a whole year before you could travel back. So, let's say about 6 months to get there. You got to wait a year on the surface of Mars, which again, you got to bring your oxygen. You got to bring, actually there's ways to get the oxygen out of the soil, but you would have to bring your water if you're not near any ice to convert the ice into water. Anyhow, hopefully people will go to Mars, and of course then it's 6 months back. All right, I'll talk to you about about Jupiter in the next chapter.